They say that in ancient times, to reach 30 was to be old. Imagine living in a world where the milestones we take for granted today were rare, fragile, and fleeting. But was it really that way, or is the story more complicated? Welcome, dear friend, to another chapter of our journey through the past. Before we begin, if you enjoy these stories, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep sharing them with the world, and we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what time it is, where you're listening, and from which corner of the world you've joined us. It's always a joy to see these voices connect across time and distance. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into the lives of those who came before us. If you wished to survive the ancient world, your first and greatest trial was not war, famine, or plague. It was your own childhood. For millions of children across history, life ended before it ever truly began. Parents did not worry about grades or sugar intake. Their fear was simpler, heavier. Would their baby live through the night? Step into the streets of an ancient city. Perhaps it is Thebes in the age of the pharaohs, or a Roman port, or a medieval market town in northern Europe. The details shift, but the dangers remain the same. Houses crouch close together, built of mud brick or rough timber. Smoke drifts from open hearths, filling narrow rooms with warmth and choking air. Chickens scatter in alleyways. Dogs nose through refuse. Children play barefoot in the dust. The air hums with flies, and every cup of water carries a question. Will it nourish, or will it kill? A newborn lies swaddled in cloth, its tiny breaths fragile against the noise of the world. To us, such a child seems only at the beginning of life, but in ancient eyes, it was already at risk. Fevers burned bright and fast. Coughs rattled small chests until silence followed. A simple cut could fester into something far worse. What we now cure with a spoonful of medicine was for them a battle they almost always lost. Historians estimate that in many societies, a third or more of children never reach their 5th birthday. Imagine a family of 6, rejoicing at each birth, only to bury 2 or 3 little ones before they learn to speak clearly. Childhood was not a gentle introduction to life. It was a battlefield with invisible enemies, parasites, infections, hunger, and chance. And yet, families clung to hope. Cultures across the world developed small shields against the darkness. In Rome, parents tied tiny charms around their children's necks, fascina, shaped like little phalluses, to ward off the evil eye. It sounds strange to us, even comic, but to them it was a talisman against loss. In Greece, children offered locks of hair to the gods when they reached adolescence, a symbolic thanks for surviving dangers that claimed so many. In medieval Europe, parents hurried their newborns to baptism, not out of ritual, but urgency. An unbaptized child, should it die, was believed to wander outside salvation. A mother might clutch her baby through the night, praying for just enough time to bring it to the church font. Behind these practices lay the constant weight of fear. Parents celebrated births, but their joy was always tempered. Would this child grow into speech, into play, into memory, or would the grave claim it before a name was carved into the world? Love was strong, but it was love shadowed by dread. And when death came, the responses were rarely medical. Midwives applied honey to wounds. Healers brewed herbs to ease fevers. Priests muttered prayers against unseen spirits. Sometimes these remedies worked. Honey, after all, is a natural antibiotic. Often they did not. Governments looked on with indifference. A king's concern was the strength of his armies. An emperor's the taxes his subjects paid. Individual children were left to fate. A village might bury half its little ones, and the world moved on. What did parents feel in the face of such loss? Historians disagree. Some argue that grief was muted, that families harden themselves against the risk of attachment. Others find evidence of deep tenderness, lullabies carved in clay, letters, mourning tiny coffins, burial grounds filled with offerings of toys and carved animals. Perhaps the truth lies between. Parents loved fiercely, but they loved with the knowledge that their love might soon be tested by grief. So childhood in the past was never a certainty. It was a passage through fire, a test written into the fabric of existence. Those who survived carried scars of hunger, illness, and sorrow, but they carried them into adulthood, proof that life could endure. And so, when we repeat the claim that ancient people died at 30, we should pause. The truth is not that all lives ended young. It is that so many lives ended before they could truly begin. Survival itself was the greatest victory of all. Surviving childhood was only the first battle. If you managed to stumble past the fevers, the accidents, and the silent threats of the cradle, life did not suddenly become safe. It simply introduced you to new dangers and to the strange world of ancient medicine. Imagine lying in a small chamber of mud brick, the air heavy with smoke and incense. You are sick. Perhaps a wound from a farming accident, or a cough that refuses to leave. Your family calls for a healer. In Egypt, he arrives holding a scroll of medical papyri, its surface filled with neat lines of hieroglyphs. The words mix recipes and prayers, honey and spells, bandages and charms. In Rome, the physician might carry bronze instruments that glint with menace, scalpels, hooks, saws. In medieval Europe, the doctor comes cloaked in robes, muttering Latin as he inspects your pulse and mutters about imbalances of humors. The treatments could be both practical and bizarre. Egyptians packed wounds with honey to fight infection, something we now know truly worked. They also applied moldy bread, which without their knowledge contained the very penicillin that would not be discovered until the 20th century. But alongside this science was sorcery. A spell might be whispered into the bandage, calling on the gods to drive out evil spirits lurking in the flesh. And surgery? It was raw, brutal, and astonishing. Archaeologists have found skulls with neat, round holes drilled into them. Trepanation, the act of cutting into the skull to release pain or spirits. Many of these skulls show signs of healing, proof that patients sometimes survived. Imagine lying still while someone scraped away a piece of your skull, with no anesthesia, no antiseptic, only courage and chance. Dentistry was its own trial. The Mayans, in their search for beauty, drilled into teeth to insert tiny pieces of jade or turquoise. The Romans, less glamorous, believed urine made a fine mouthwash. Meanwhile, medieval peasants chewed twigs to clean their teeth, while the wealthy powdered their mouths with herbs and hoped their breath did not betray decay. When pain became unbearable, the solution was simple and terrible: extraction, with iron forceps heated in the fire. In times of war, surgery became desperate. A soldier pierced by an arrow might be laid upon a table as the shaft was pulled free with shaking hands. The wound cauterized with burning iron. Screams filled the night. Prayers followed, and survival was uncertain. Yet some endured, hobbling into old age with scars that told stories more vivid than words. And always, there was the theory of humors, the belief that the human body was ruled by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, they thought, was caused by imbalance. Too much blood, then bleed the patient with a leech, or cut open a vein to let life flow away in the hope of health. Too much phlegm, prescribe, purging or induce vomiting. The treatments often harmed more than they helped, yet they were trusted for centuries. Authorities offered little beyond ritual. Priests prayed. Rulers decreed days of fasting. Entire communities marched barefoot in penitence when plagues spread. Sometimes an emperor summoned foreign doctors, importing knowledge like exotic spices. But for the common person, the cure was local, often improvised, and always uncertain. Historians look back with fascination, asking, were these people foolish or simply resourceful with the tools they had? The answer leans toward respect, for within the mix of error and superstition, there were truths. Honey healed, herbs soothed, and observation taught lessons that built the first steps of medicine. Their failures became the soil from which modern knowledge grew. And so the lesson of ancient medicine is not only fear, but persistence. People clung to life with whatever tools they could grasp: herbs, prayers, knives, or charms. To live meant to endure, and to endure meant to try. It is easy to laugh at their methods, but harder not to admire their courage. Close your eyes and imagine it again. The healer bending over a wound, the chant of words old and strange, the press of a hand offering comfort. In those moments, history reminds us that survival was never just about numbers or averages. It was about the will to fight for life, even when the cure was as dangerous as the disease. You may have heard the cliché that people in the past were filthy, that they trudged through mud and never bathed, that entire centuries smelled of sweat, dung, and despair. And yes, sometimes it did, but the truth, as always, is far stranger and more complicated. In some ways, they were dirtier than we imagine. In other ways, surprisingly clean. Imagine Rome at its height. Marble baths gleam beneath mosaicked ceilings. The air steams with heat, scented by oils and perfumes. Citizens step from pool to pool, hot, cold, tepid, chatting about politics, reciting poetry, or whispering gossip as attendants scrape their skin with curved metal strigils. This was not luxury for the few. It was a rhythm of daily life. Even the poor could enter for a coin, washing away the dust of the city in grand communal spaces. Cleanliness was not only about health, but identity. To be Roman was to be washed, perfumed, and civilized. Now cross to medieval Europe. Centuries later, here the story twists. Bathhouses still existed. Many towns had them. But gradually suspicion crept in. Doctors whispered that hot water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to disease. Priests warned that public baths led to sin, for too many eyes wandered when garments were left at the door. And so, little by little, the baths closed. People began to wash less eyes and to replace water with linen. A clean shirt against the skin freshly laundered was believed to draw out the dirt and protect the body. It worked in a way. Linen does absorb sweat, but it was hardly the same as a plunge in cool water. And yet, medieval people were not as filthy as we paint them. They combed their hair daily, trimmed their nails, and scrubbed their faces with cloths dipped in scented water. Monks bathed at least a few times a year, sometimes more, and noble women kept chests of perfumes and powders. Soap, made from animal fat and ash, was widely known. The problem was not ignorance, but fear. Fear that too much washing might invite sickness or tempt the soul to vanity. Travel further back, and the story grows stranger. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets record recipes for soap mixed with aromatic oils. The Egyptians shaved their entire bodies, not only for vanity, but for cleanliness, to avoid lice and disease. They bathed daily in the Nile, an act both spiritual and practical. Priests scrubbed with natron salt before entering temples, believing that purity of the body pleased the gods. Even in the so-called Dark Ages, fragments of cleanliness survived. Vikings bathed once a week, more often, in fact, than many Christian peasants around them. Arab travelers to northern Europe noted with surprise how often Norsemen washed and combed their hair, winning admiration and sometimes suspicion from foreign women. But hygiene was always tied to health, and health was a mystery. To wash was to risk imbalance, to expose yourself to invisible dangers. When the Black Death swept through Europe, physicians sometimes recommended avoiding baths altogether. People closed their doors, sat wrapped in unwashed clothes, and prayed the air would pass over them. It did not. Yet rituals of cleanliness still mattered deeply. Romans left sponges on sticks in communal latrines, shared by dozens, dipped in buckets of vinegar water. To us, the idea feels unhygienic, but in their world it was the accepted rhythm of life. In medieval castles, rushes were strewn across floors and changed when the smell grew too strong, but herbs were mixed in to mask odors, rosemary and lavender covering the rot beneath. The irony is sharp. Some of these practices worked. Herbs drove away fleas, vinegar killed bacteria, but others failed miserably. A belief that dirt itself protected from plague meant some people lived for months without washing, their skin laid in sweat and dust. Instead of safety, they carried sickness with them. Authorities rarely imposed strict rules on bathing. In Rome, emperors built bathhouses to win public favor. In medieval towns, councils sometimes banned them, linking them to outbreaks of disease or to immorality. The people followed, swaying between indulgence and abstinence, between the scent of oils and the crust of neglect. Historians debate how we should judge the past. Were they dirty by necessity or cautious by logic? Were they clean by instinct or vain by desire? Archaeology shows both truths. Soap remnants, perfume bottles, combs and mirrors tell one story. Mass graves, lice combs full of eggs, and parasite-ridden remains tell another. Cleanliness was never absolute. It was a struggle, a constant negotiation with nature, fear, and belief. And so, hygiene was never just about appearances. It was a quiet but decisive factor in how long someone lived. A culture that valued bathing and cleanliness often gave its people the chance to outlive the grim statistics, while neglect or misguided fears about washing could drag life expectancy down. Clean water, clean skin, and even the simplest rituals were not luxuries. They were survival strategies, and in the struggle to push past that fragile threshold of 30 years, these choices made all the difference. So when we laugh at their sponges, or their soap of ashes, or their perfumes to mask the smell of decay, we should pause. They were trying, just as we try, to live in bodies that betray us, in worlds that threaten us. Cleanliness was not just about health, it was about hope. To understand life expectancy in the ancient world, we must step into the lives of women. For men, survival often hinged on war, work, or accident. For women, the battlefield was closer to home. Written into their very bodies, childbirth, nutrition, and social status were the invisible dice that determined whether they lived long or became one more number pulling the average downward. Imagine an Egyptian woman in 1400 BC. She walks along the banks of the Nile, her belly heavy with child. She has already buried 2 infants, tiny bodies laid to rest with amulets and prayers. This time, she hopes the gods will grant her mercy, but hope is fragile. Childbirth, even in the best conditions, was perilous. In some places, 1 out of every 3 women died, giving life. The irony is sharp. In creating the next generation, women often sacrificed their own futures. Across civilizations, the story repeats. In Greece, women lived in the shadow of early death, many not because they were weaker, but because pregnancy was relentless. A girl married young, sometimes at 14, her body barely ready. By 20, she might already have carried 3 or 4 children. Each birth increased the risk of infection, hemorrhage, or fever. Few records describe these deaths in detail, but the silence of history is telling. Graves filled with young women, their skeletons bearing the marks of repeated pregnancies, tell the story louder than words. And yet, Not all women faced the same odds. In Rome, elite women had physicians at their side, midwives trained in herbal remedies and birthing positions. They survived more often, their long lives carved in statues and epitaphs. But poor women, they delivered in cramped houses, with only neighbors or family to help. Their deaths were common, their names forgotten. Life expectancy was as much about class as it was about gender, even beyond childbirth. Women's survival was shaped by food. In times of famine, men often ate first. Women and children received what was left. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making childbirth even more dangerous. In medieval Europe, poor women often lived on bread, pottage, and beer, diets that filled the belly but lacked vital nutrients. Their bones tell the tale, brittle from lack of calcium, stunted from lack of protein. Their shortened lives dragged down the averages. But there were exceptions that remind us of resilience. In ancient Egypt, women could own property, run businesses, and manage estates. Some lived long enough to leave records of transactions, legal documents written in their names. Cleopatra's ancestors survived into old age, proof that with wealth and status, women could thrive as long as men. In Mesopotamia, too, marriage contracts gave women rights to food and protection, small safeguards that nudged survival upward. Historians debate how women felt about this fragility. Did they live in constant fear, or did they, like their husbands and fathers, accept death as an ordinary neighbor? Letters from Roman mothers speak of fierce attachment to their children. Epitaphs carved for wives describe not only love, but admiration for endurance. She bore 3 children and lived. The fact that survival itself was praised tells us everything. So when we look at life expectancy and see the shadow of 30 years, women's lives are written into that number. Their risks were not only personal, but demographic. A village where many women died young saw its entire average pulled downward. Each childbirth was not just a family's trial, but a statistic in the making. And yet, some women endured. Some lived into their 50s, 60s, even 70s, carrying the marks of a lifetime's work and survival. Their stories, though less told, remind us that life expectancy was never destiny. It was chance, shaped by biology, culture, and resilience. The lesson is quiet, but powerful. For women, survival meant defying the odds written into their bodies, and in defying those odds, they carried humanity forward. If childhood was the first battlefield, and childbirth the second, then daily labor was the third. For most of human history, survival was measured not in years, but in tasks completed, the field plowed, the grain harvested, the firewood chopped, the water carried, and for every step forward, the body paid a price. Picture a medieval farmer, rising at dawn. The air is cold, the soil damp. He bends to his work, hour after hour, muscles straining as he pushes a wooden plow behind oxen. His hands are calloused, his back already hunched, though he is barely 30. To us he looks old, not because his years are many, but because labor has carved decades into his bones. Archaeologists who study skeletons of peasants find spines ground down with arthritis, knees worn smooth from years of bending, teeth cracked from chewing bread filled with stone dust from grinding mills. These were not the marks of old age, they were the marks of survival. Accidents were constant companions. A slip of the scythe, a fall from a ladder, a horse's kick, any of these could maim or kill. Without antibiotics or surgery, a simple fracture might fester into infection. A cut on the hand could become fatal sepsis within days. For workers, the boundary between labor and death was thin and often invisible. Not all work was equal. Soldiers carried their lives on the edge of a blade, often dead in their 20s, their bodies sacrificed to ambition and war. Miners, in Rome or in medieval Europe, breathed dust that slowly filled their lungs, shortening their lives to mere decades. Builders fell from scaffolds, sailors drowned at sea, blacksmiths burned their flesh in sudden accidents. These lives rarely reached the safety of old age, and their deaths pulled the average life expectancy down. But there were others, scribes, monks, philosophers, whose work demanded little more than thought and patience. Their hands held pens instead of plows, their bodies sat in cloisters instead of fields. These men often lived longer, their bones showing fewer signs of strain, their epitaphs recording lives that stretched into their 60s, 70s, sometimes beyond. The work they did shielded them, and their survival reminds us that life expectancy was not fate, but circumstance. And yet, even the privileged were not safe. A senator might choke on bad food, a monk might succumb to fever, a scribe's eyes might fail. The world was precarious for everyone, but still, the work of survival tilted the scales. Those forced into endless physical toil rarely outlived the shadow of 30. Those who escaped it, sometimes, had the luxury of decades more. Authorities rarely intervened. Labor was the lifeblood of kingdoms. If workers died young, new ones were born. The cycle replaced itself, generation after generation. The suffering of individuals did not stop the rhythm of harvest or construction. In this sense, the short lives of the many built the long-lasting monuments of the few. Historians piece together these truths from bones, worn spines, broken ribs healed poorly, jaws ground flat by grit in bread. Each skeleton is a biography without words. From them we see that hard work did not only feed the body, it consumed it. And this constant consumption explains why so many lives ended before 50, why the average lingered so low. So when we hear that people died at 30, we must remember the fields, the mines, the workshops. Life was not short, because the body failed quickly, but because the world demanded everything from it, long before age could. Labor itself was a thief of years, and only those who escaped its grasp, the fortunate, the few, discovered how long a human life could truly be. If work carved down the body day by day, food or hunger set the limits of how far life could stretch. In every society, survival depended on what was eaten, how much of it, and how often. To study life expectancy without food is like studying a fire without its fuel. Imagine the table of a peasant family in medieval Europe. Dinner is a wooden bowl of pottage, a watery stew of barley, peas, and a few shreds of vegetable flavored, if luck allows, with a scrap of salted pork. Bread, coarse and dark, is served with it. But this bread is not the fluffy loaf we know today, ground on rough stone mills. It contains flecks of grit that slowly grind away at the teeth. Archaeologists examining medieval skulls find jaws worn down almost to the roots, abscesses festering where enamel once protected. Pain was constant, infection common, and lifespan quietly shortened, not by dramatic plagues, but by the steady toll of chewing daily bread. Across the Mediterranean, Egyptian families ate bread as well, often flat loaves of emmer wheat, paired with onions, beans, and beer. Simple, filling, but monotonous. In times of plenty, this diet could sustain life into old age. But when the Nile failed to flood, famine followed. Grain stores emptied, bellies shrank, and the fragile bodies of children and the elderly gave way first. In those years, life expectancy collapsed. Famine was not an exception. It was a rhythm. In Europe, harvests failed every decade or two. A summer too wet, a winter too long, and suddenly villages starved. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 killed millions, not through war or plague, but through hunger. Contemporary writers describe fields bare of crops, families boiling weeds for soup, desperate parents abandoning infants to save themselves. In those years, life expectancy plunged to terrifying lows. Even survivors bore scars, malnutrition in childhood, stunted growth, weakened bones, and left the body vulnerable to disease for decades. And yet, diet was not equal. Nobles dined on roasted meats, fish, cheeses, honey cakes, and spiced wine. Their bodies grew strong, their bones dense. They carried enough calories to endure sickness and famine better than peasants. Skeletal evidence confirms this divide. Aristocrats often lived longer, not because their blood was noble, but because their stomachs were full. Still, luxury carried risks of its own. The Roman elite, indulging in feasts of fatty meats and rich sauces, left behind skeletons with gout and hardened arteries, proof that too much food could shorten life as surely as too little. Longevity, it seemed, was not guaranteed at either end of the table. What people ate determined not just survival, but resilience. A child raised on thin gruel was less likely to survive measles or a fever. A mother lacking iron and calcium risked her life in childbirth. An old man without protein saw his body waste before age truly claimed him. Food was never just about hunger. It was about the ability to withstand all the other enemies of life. Authorities understood this, at least in part. Egyptian pharaohs stored grain in great silos, releasing it in years of famine to steady the land. Roman emperors built their popularity by distributing free grain, the famous bread and circuses. Medieval kings ordered price controls on bread when shortages threatened revolt. These measures were not acts of compassion alone. They were survival strategies for entire populations. Still, when harvests failed badly enough, no decree could save the hungry. Historians debate how central famine was to life expectancy. Some argue that disease killed more. Others insist hunger was the root cause, weakening the body so that disease could strike. The truth is they were inseparable. Malnutrition and sickness were partners, each sharpening the other's blade. So when we ask, did people die at 30? Food answers loudly. Many did not reach adulthood at all, because hunger stole their strength before life could unfold. And even for those who lived past youth, famine could snatch away years in an instant. Yet those who ate well, the fortunate, the resilient, often lived long. The difference between 30 and 70 was often as simple and as profound as what lay in the bowl at supper. In the end, diet was destiny. It filled bones with strength or hollowed them with weakness. It lifted some into the realm of old age while dragging others down into early graves. And so, in every society, the struggle for food was also the struggle for life itself. If famine gnawed slowly at life, disease struck like lightning. It could sweep through a city in days, crush armies without a battle, and fill graveyards faster than earth could cover them. For centuries, disease was the great leveler of humanity, pulling averages down and reminding even the strongest that life was fragile. Picture a Roman street in the 2nd century. Merchants call out their wares. Children dart between stalls. Bread ovens smoke. Then a cough begins in the crowd. Another follows. Soon the market quiets, for news spreads faster than trade. Fever has entered the city. Within weeks, entire families vanish. This was the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, that may have killed 5 million people, including emperors. To live in Rome was no guarantee of survival, not when disease turned the empire itself into a tomb. Centuries later, in 14th century Europe, another shadow fell, the Black Death. Imagine a town where the bells ring daily, not for celebration, but for burials. Rats scurry under doors, fleas bite, and within days, Skin darkens with buboes, fevers burn, and silence follows. In only a few years, a third of Europe was gone. Life expectancy collapsed overnight. For those born in these years, the average lifespan was not 30. It was barely 20, or 10, or none at all. And yet, plague was not the only enemy. Leprosy disfigured slowly, consuming flesh and social status alike. Tuberculosis haunted lungs for decades, coughing away life breath by breath. Malaria drained vitality in warmer regions, a recurring specter that stole strength year after year. Even parasites, worms crawling unseen within the gut, weakened bodies until every sickness struck harder. But here lies the paradox. Epidemics lowered averages, but survivors often lived long. Archaeologists studying skeletons find signs of plague survivors who went on to reach their 50s or 60s, their bones telling of hard years endured, but endured nonetheless. Immunity, once earned, became a kind of shield. A child who lived through smallpox bore scars, but also a greater chance of growing old. Survival was not only luck, but resilience carved into the flesh. Authorities, desperate and confused, offered responses that often mismatched the threat. Roman doctors bled the sick, believing bad humors needed draining. Medieval priests led processions of flagellants, whipping their backs to atone for sin, hoping their pain would soften divine wrath. Cities banned strangers, closed gates, or ordered fumigations of herbs, convinced that smoke might cleanse the air. Some measures helped. Quarantines, invented in Venice, truly slowed disease, but many did not. The gap between knowledge and need shortened countless lives. Historians debate which mattered more, sudden epidemics or constant endemic diseases. Was it the cataclysm of plague that kept life expectancy low, or the quiet, ceaseless drain of fevers, coughs, and worms? The truth is both. A great epidemic could cut entire decades off the average in one generation, but even in quieter years, disease pressed on. The body was never free of enemies. And so, when we repeat that people died at 30, disease is the shadow behind the myth. It killed infants before they walked, mothers before they raised their children, workers before their hands grew old. But it did not kill all. The survivors remind us that life expectancy was not destiny. To endure the storm of disease was to claim years denied to so many. The lesson is sharp but clear. Epidemics dragged humanity's averages down, but the human body proved tougher than the statistics suggest. For every plague victim in the grave, there was a survivor who lived on, carrying the memory of loss, but also the proof that 30 was never the full measure of life. For so long, we have lingered among graves of children, the cries of mothers, the toll of work, and the shadow of famine and plague. The statistics whisper their cruel average 30 years. But let us pause and listen to another truth. People did grow old. They limped into their 60s, their 70s, even their 80s, carrying with them the proof that human life has always had the potential for length. Picture an elderly man in Athens, around 400 BC. His beard is white, his body thin, but his mind sharp. He has outlived wars, outlived famine, outlived plague. He gathers in the agora to listen to philosophers debate justice and virtue. This is no rare invention of legend. Plato himself lived into his 80s, and Sophocles, the playwright, composed tragedies in his 90s. In their survival, we see not the exception of immortality, but the endurance of bodies and minds that managed to outlast the gauntlet of youth. In Rome, inscriptions on tombstones speak of women who reached 70, men who saw 80. Epitaphs carved into stone proudly announce, lived 72 years, 10 months, 12 days. Such precision tells us something profound. Old age was rare enough to celebrate, but real enough to count. Archaeological evidence supports this. Skeletons of elders show the telltale signs of arthritis, worn teeth, fused joints. They suffered, yes, but they lived long enough to feel the aches of years that statistics pretend did not exist. In medieval villages too, the elderly were remembered. Chronicles describe grey-haired men advising councils, grandmothers telling stories by the hearth, their voices raspy but strong. The Anglo-Saxon poem, The Wanderer, mourns the passing of companions, but the speaker himself is an old man, living long enough to reflect. Monastic records note abbots ruling well into their 70s, their endurance recorded with reverence. But what did old age mean in a world where few reached it? To grow old was not only survival, it was status. Elders became the keepers of memory, walking libraries in societies where books were scarce. A grandmother might be the only person alive who remembered a great famine. An old soldier might be the last witness of a forgotten war. To live long was to carry history in one's own body. Yet the road to longevity was narrow. Only those who survived the hazards of childhood, who endured childbirth, who avoided famine, who escaped plague, who did not break under labor, only they had the chance to age. Life expectancy was 30. Yes, but that was an average, weighed down by all the dead, who never had the chance to live. For those who crossed the threshold of 20, the odds improved dramatically. Many could, and did, see 50, 60, or beyond. Old age itself was not kind. Without spectacles, the world blurred. Without dentistry, jaws ached, bones broke easily, joints stiffened, skin sagged. But there was also resilience. Farmers' hands, bent from decades of work, still grasped tools. Elders leaned on canes, but walked, slowly, across village squares. And when death came at 70 or 80, it was not sudden, not tragic. It was the quiet end of a long struggle. Authorities often honored long life. In Rome, a centenarian was paraded in public festivals as living proof of divine favor. In Egypt, elders were respected in temples, their wisdom seen as a bridge to the gods. In China, which kept more precise records, imperial officials noted with pride those who passed the century mark. Even in Europe, where famine and disease cut lives short, communities turned to their elders for guidance, valuing survival as a kind of wisdom earned. Historians debate how common this longevity truly was. Some argue that examples of 80 or 90-year-olds are rare jewels, not the rule. Others, studying bones, conclude that if one survived youth, a lifespan much like our own was possible. The truth, all days between old age was rarer than today, but never absent. The human body has always had the potential to stretch life decades beyond 30. It was not biology that cut lives short, but circumstance. So when we hear the myth that people died at 30, old age answers back. It tells us of philosophers composing in their 80s, of farmers living long enough to see their grandchildren born, of women remembered fondly after decades of toil. It tells us that human life has always been capable of endurance, if chance permitted. The sight of an elder in antiquity was a living reminder that the statistics lied. They stood as proof that 30 was not an ending, but an average dragged down by graves of the young. Their grey hair was not only age, it was victory. So did ancient people really die at 30? By now, you know the answer is more complicated, even far more interesting. The number itself is not a lie, but it is a distortion. Averages have a way of hiding as much as they reveal. Here's the trick. When historians say that life expectancy in the Middle Ages was 30, or that in Rome it was 28, what they mean is that the average age at death hovered there. But averages are shaped by extremes. Imagine a village where half the children die before the age of 5. Their short lives drag the entire number downward. Add famine years, plagues, or war, and suddenly the average plummets, even if many adults in that same community live into their 60s. To put it another way, Life expectancy in antiquity wasn't about the body wearing out early. It was about chance. Survive the first years of life, and your odds improve dramatically. In some medieval populations, if you reached the age of 20, you could expect to live at least another 30 or 40 years. In Rome, inscriptions of 70 and 80-year-olds proved that old age was not a fantasy. The average looked short because it counted the babies who never learned to walk, the mothers lost in childbirth, the soldiers cut down in war. This is why the myth survives. We look at the numbers and picture everyone collapsing at 30, but in reality, the 30 is a graveyard average, not a biological ceiling. It tells us more about the fragility of survival than about the limits of human life. Historians debate the best way to explain this. Some prefer to present life expectancy at birth, which includes all infant deaths, while others calculate life expectancy at age 15 or at age 20, which show much longer spans. A man who reached adulthood in the Middle Ages could often expect to see his 50s or 60s. A woman, if she survived childbirth, might live just as long. These numbers don't erase the suffering, but they do reshape the story. Think of it in modern terms. Imagine we measured today's life expectancy, but included every infant who died at birth. The average would sink, perhaps by decades, even though millions of people now live into their 70s and 80s. That is exactly what ancient statistics do to the past. So when you hear that people only live to 30, remember it was never a death sentence at 31. It was a reflection of risk. Life was shorter, not because humans were weaker, but because the world around them was harsher. Survival tilted the averages down, even while the human body remained as capable of longevity as it is today. The myth lingers because it feels dramatic. It paints the past as brutish and brief, a time when grey hair was unthinkable. But reality is more nuanced, more human. Yes, life was fragile. Yes, death was near. But those who survived the gauntlet often lived long enough to grow old, complain about youth, and pass down wisdom. The truth, then, is not that people died at 30. The truth is that so many never had the chance to live that long. So, dear listener, we began together with a myth, the old belief that people in the past lived short, hurried lives, that 30 was the end, that humanity itself was fragile and fleeting. But now you know the fuller truth. Life was not a straight line to an early grave. It was a journey across dangers, childhood fevers, childbirth, famine, disease, and the relentless grind of work. Each stage cut lives short, and each loss dragged the averages down. The number 30 is not the age at which people collapsed, but the shadow of statistics, built from graves of infants, mothers, workers, and soldiers. It is not the measure of the body's strength, but the measure of how precarious the world once was. And yet, among those shadows, people endured. Some reached old age, their bones aching, their teeth worn, but their minds alive. Some lived to see grandchildren play, some to pass down wisdom, some simply to sit in the quiet of years earned. Their longevity was not an accident. It was proof that the human body has always carried the potential for decades of life, if only chance allowed. The truth, then, is that 30 was never destiny. It was never the limit of human life. It was the weight of loss pressing down on the numbers. And what matters most is not the averages, but the resilience behind them. If for every child who did not survive, there was one who did. For every life cut short, another pushed on, through hunger, through sickness, through grief, into a future that statistics forget to count. So, dear listener, as you let these thoughts settle tonight, remember that long lives are not modern inventions. They have always been with us, hidden behind the averages, waiting for us to see them clearly. Life has always been fragile, but it has also always been strong. And perhaps the greatest lesson history leaves us is not how short life once was, but how enduring it has always been. Now, as we close this journey together, may you carry that resilience in your own heart, and may your night be gentle, your rest deep, and your dreams filled with peace. Good night.